Welcome back, my dear friends. Last episode ended on such a note that could be the perfect end to the whole story itself. But we still have a very long way to go. Here I am with another story from the town of Silent Hill. Make yourself comfortable and get ready to listen to another chapter of this horrifying city. After an extremely successful in all aspects Silent Hill 2, the developers started working on the third part of the game. The first trailer of the game was shown on E3 2002, and in less than a year the game could be easily found in game stores. The very first surprise for the players turned out to be the main hero of the game, or the main shiro to be specific. It's the first time when a player will be able to play for a female character, a young girl called Heather. She suddenly finds herself in the lakeside amusement park. There is rust and monsters around, and Heather is holding a knife. She decides to look around and explore the current location, and when she climbs to the top of the amusement ride, she gets bitten by the trolley. After that, she wakes up in the fast food restaurant in the shopping mall, which is not connected to the Silent Hill by all means. Everything she saw was simply a dream. She calls her dad to tell him that she is about to go back home, but at the moment a private detective, Douglas Cartland, catches her attention. He says that he possesses an important information for her that concerns her birth, but Heather doesn't want to listen to him and hides in the girl's bathroom. She gets out through the window and decides to continue her way back home. Returning back to the mall, she meets a monster in one of the shops that's feasting on a human corpse. Heather grabs a pistol she's found on the floor and, in a bout of panic, shoots a whole magazine into an awful creature. After a while, our protagonist will meet a barefooted white-haired woman. Her name is Claudia Wolf, and she claims that the appearance of monsters is a manifestation of divine will, and asks Heather to remember her true self, so the rebirth of paradise will happen on the earth. Then Claudia leaves, and our protagonist has to continue her unexpected journey through the mall that becomes more and more frightening. But after defeating the first boss, the environment gets back to normal.
What? It's the shopping mall just like before.
Douglas comes out from the shadow and says that he's confused just like Heather. The girl accuses him of being in agreement about these dark deals with Claudia. The detective says that he knows who Claudia is, since she's the one who hired him to find Heather, but that's it. But Heather doesn't trust his words and runs away into the subway to finally get back home.
What should I do?
Hell if I know.
Of course, there is nothing but awful things like monsters and darkness are waiting for her on the ground. At one moment, she's barely hit by the train and she won't be able to reach the needed station. Our protagonist will have to go through tunnels and canalization pipes and then reach the surface and find herself in an unfinished building. She'll manage to get to the nearby building, where she'll have to perform a rather long run. On her way, she'll meet one more character, Vincent Smith, a cultured-looking person who definitely knows about Heather more than he should. Also, he behaves quite odd and doesn't seem to be afraid of the terrifying creatures around. That's why Heather decides that he's alongside with Claudia, although Vincent denies it and clearly doesn't have any sympathy for Claudia. But in the dialogue, the name of Heather's father is mentioned for the first time, Harry, and some gamers familiar with Silent Hill games could start suspecting something. When a player gets back home, an unpleasant surprise will be waiting for him: Harry Mason's dead body. This is one of the main plot twists of the third Silent Hill. Turns out that Heather is none other than Cheryl, or Alessa. She's the baby that Harry Mason, the main character of the first part, took from Silent Hill 17 years ago. After the death of Delia, the existence of Silent Hill's cult didn't come to an end. Claudia became in charge of it and organized the search of Alessa in order to make their god rise again. But let's return to Heather's house, where a poor girl is crying over her father's body. At some time she notices a blood trail that leads to the window and is seen on the stairs that leads to the rooftop. There we can find Claudia claiming that she had to kill Harry so the god could be reborn and bring heaven. Heather doesn't want to listen to that nonsense again and decides to shoot her. But suddenly a monster appears and our protagonist has to fight him. Taking the advantage of this halt, Claudia gets away, but claiming that they will meet again in the town of Silent Hill.
I'll be waiting where all begins. In the town of Silent Hill.
After coming back to the apartment, Heather finds Douglas there and starts blaming him for finding them, telling that Claudia would never find them if it weren't him. But then she realizes that it's not his fault. He was just a pawn in Claudia's evil plans. And Heather decides to go to the mysterious town of Silent Hill in order to meet Claudia and avenge her for the death of her dad. Douglas volunteers to help her because he understands that he's partly responsible for what's happened. Douglas mentions that he met Vincent too, and he advised them to find a person called Leonard after arriving to Silent Hill. And since there are no other clues, they decide to follow his advice. On their way to Silent Hill, Heather will tell Douglas the story of her past. This is just a short retell of the plot of the first game. Tells him about the cult, about the sacrifice of Alessa, about the god and how her dad managed to prevent all this. But now he's dead. After arriving to the city, this wonderful couple settles into a hotel and decides to split. Douglas will go to Leonard's house and search it through, and Heather will visit Brookhaven Hospital in order to meet Leonard himself. Leonard turns out to be none other than Claudia's father. He used to be a highly placed member of the cult, but then he got mad and he was taken into asylum. When a player finally gets to his chamber and finds Leonard, he will discover that poor man is not a human being anymore, so the only way to put an end to this is to kill him. After defeating him, Heather will take Metatron's seal from his dead body, the artifact that can prevent the rebirth of God, according to Vincent. Soon enough, our protagonist will return to the hotel room, finding there not Douglas, but Vincent. He says that Douglas asked him to pass along the message to Heather, saying that she has to go to the church, which is situated on the other side of the lake. In order to get there, she has to go through Lakeside Amusement Park and find herself in the same place as she were in the beginning of the game. Meanwhile, Douglas finds Claudia and starts accusing her of her lies. She had told him that Harry Mason actually kidnapped Heather. In return, he gets only another story about the god, and that only with Heather's help Claudia will be able to give birth to a new god that will bring peace, without pain, suffering, war, famine and death. But that speeches don't inspire Detective. He says that such a world would be simply boring. No this, no that, he says, and points his gun at Claudia after that. After the cutscene ends, Heather will find Douglas sitting on the floor with his leg broken. He didn't manage to kill Claudia, so now only Heather can put an end to this nightmare. But still, Douglas thinks that the easiest way to put an end to all this would be to kill the girl, right here, right now. But he simply could not pull the trigger.
What are you doing?
Maybe killing you here is the only way to end this nightmare.
Yeah, you might be right.
In church, a player will be met by Claudia. She says that resurrection of God is near. He'll come to the world and save it from suffering and pain. But Heather doesn't like this plan and she decides to shoot this obsessed woman, although she doesn't accomplish. Girl's body is fulgurated by a sharp pain. This is the embryo of a future god is about to be born. Using this moment, Claudia gets away. The church turns into a mad hell on Earth, reminding the final level of the first game. Mazes of infernal corridors, metal constructions, and a great amount of monsters. A player will have to wander around this place for quite a time and meet Vincent once again. We'll find out that he is also a member of this cult and believes in the same god as Claudia, but he doesn't want God's resurrection. That's why he's been helping Heather all along.
You mean this thing?
Yes, that's it. As long as we have that, we're fine.
When Heather finally manages to get to the sanctuary of the church, she witnesses the act of argue between Vincent and Claudia, in the end of which Vincent will receive a traitorous stab in the back.
You can kill her now.
You go to hell!
Claudia explains that God could only be resurrected through pain, suffering, and anger of the possessor. Death of Heather's father was a great catalyzer, and now all those feelings have reached its peak. The god is almost ready to be reborn.
Even as a child, I knew I would see the coming of this day. I knew I would be a witness to it. Judgment Day!
Heather tries to use the Seal of Metatron to stop the process, but soon she finds out that Vincent was wrong about it, and the artifact can't help at all. But then she remembers about the locket, a present from her dad. There is Aglaophotis inside it, the substance that helped Harry Mason to take down Incubus 17 years ago. Heather eats it and as a result burps out the embryo of an unborn god. She wants to shred it to pieces, but Claudia interferes, takes the embryo and swallows it so she could be a vessel for the resurrection.
Claudia!
Lessa, you cannot kill God. I will burn God.
In the end, Claudia dies and instead of her, not fully formed God appears, with a face that was quite similar to Alessa's. The final battle is about to begin. This is the end, concludes Heather. It's time for closing credits. At that very moment, Heather, completely exhausted, falls on her knees and starts crying. After the end of all this nightmare, she understands Harry is completely gone. Thoughts about revenge, Claudia and monsters have left her head. There's only a bereavement over her lost father left. But still, she finds the resolve to stand and continue living. Now we finally come to the endings, but there are not a lot of them this time. Only one finale actually. Well, no, there are 3 of them, but after the first walkthrough you'll get only the first one. Heather gets back to the amusement park where she meets Douglas. He asks whether everything's over, when Heather replies, "Not yet, you're still alive," and approaches him with a knife. But in the very end it turns into a joke.
Oh! Just a joke.
She asks not to call her Heather anymore. From now on, she is Cheryl. This is the name that Harry gave her many years ago. All in all, happy and joke about hair color and finally closing credits.
You gonna let your hair color go back too?
I don't know. Don't you think blondes have more fun?
But the second ending is not that nice. Heather is holding a knife with blood in it and Douglas is lying on the floor, dead. Maybe this ending represents the prophecy that we could hear through the game. The one who will lead us to paradise with blood-stained hands. And I've already said a player had to finish the game twice, but that's not the only condition. A player has to get 4,000 points through the game. 1 point per every hit that our protagonist gets 10 points for every killed monster, and another 1000 for completing every secondary quest. By a twist of fate, Heather will find herself in the confessional of a church, where she'll have to decide whether she forgives the woman in another room or not. And it would influence only on getting those 1000 points, and that's all. The thing is that a player won't be able to find how many points he already has, since there is no counter.
I forgive you.
Thank you, Lord.
There was one more not quite official ending. If Aglaophotis was not taken and player made any other action by accident, the god would start resurrecting. The developers even made a special cutscene for this outcome, but there will be no credits after all, only a sign game over.
God! Bring us salvation!
And finally the third ending. This one is naturally comic and is connected with aliens. In order to get this one, a player had to kill 30 monsters with a special bonus weapon. In that case, the game would end much earlier, in the middle of its original length. Heather comes back home, but it turns out that Harry Mason didn't die. He's sitting at the table and drinking tea with an alien. You can even see James Sunderland behind the curtain. Heather tells her dad about all those horrible things that happened to her on her way home from the mall. Harry gets furious after hearing that. He decides that it's time to be done with the city once and for all. In the next scene we can see several alien spaceships that burn the city to the ground with lasers. And after that, the final credit will start with a karaoke background song, which was performed by the developers making fun of the main characters. Well, let's start talking about characters, shall we? But before that, just a small off-top speech. There was a puzzle with tarot cards in the game. One would think that it's just a typical puzzle, but actually it has a great connection with the events of the game. The thing is that in the Lost Memories book there was a description of every card in the game, and it was connected to different aspects that way or another. It could be a character, place, event, or even an aspect of developing process. Today we'll talk only about some of them, the ones that refer only to the third part. Right back to the characters. The most undistinguished is Douglas Cartland, who's about 50 years old. At first he was a mere police officer, but had retired 10 years before the events of the game, and then became a detective. Was married but then got divorced. He had a son from that marriage who died afterwards. He was shot while trying to rob a bank. But judging by some of the versions, he didn't rob any bank. While talking to Claudia, Douglas mentioned that he had killed before, and there is a chance that he killed his own son.
You're going to kill me? Is it really so easy for you?
I've done it before.
The tarot card, which is connected to this character, is the Hanged Man. In the original interpretation, it means self-sacrifice. In the game, Douglas decides to help Heather, although he puts his own life in danger, for a person he barely knows. "No one's gonna cry over my grave," he says.
You know, you might die too.
That's fine. Nobody's gonna cry over my grave.
The appearance of this character was partly borrowed from actor Ian Holm and Johnny Giancarlo, and his name he got from Douglas Fairbanks. The next one is Claudia Wolf. When she was a child, her father, Leonard Wolf, was bringing her up in accordance with his religious beliefs. That's why through all the game she demonstrates her fanatic faith and dedication to the cult. But also he used to beat her a lot, making her cry and suffer. That's why Vincent thinks this is the reason she wants to resurrect God, to free this world of pain and suffering. Besides that, Claudia used to be friends with Alessa Gillespie, and after Alessa was burnt in the ritual, Claudia didn't forget her friend, but on the contrary, cherished the memory of her as a saint. The tarot card which is connected with this character is the High Priestess. Because after several years she managed to remove her dad out of his post as the head of the cult and became a head herself. After that she started her search of Alessa in order to achieve her goals, bring paradise to this world. When the girl was found, Claudia understood that the only way to make the god reborn again was to make her sister suffer. She, even against the grain, had to perform horrible deeds to Heather. Every time Claudia meets the girl, she tries to make her remember her true self and Alessa's memories.
Remember me, and your true self as well.
According to the first design, Claudia was supposed to be completely bald and covered with tattoos, but the developers thought it was too extreme for her. She got her name from an actress, Claudia Cardinale. At first she was supposed to be Christy, but then the name was changed because that name was too cute for such a character. After the events of the first game, the cult of Silent Hill was on the edge of extinction, but it was able to continue its existence thanks to Vincent's money. He is also a member of the cult, but he holds a slightly different view considering beliefs of Claudia. Clearly doesn't like her idea of God's resurrection and all that heaven and earth thing. His main goal is to stop Claudia. That's why he's desperately trying to help Heather, covering his true intentions with words and lies about helping Heather. But in fact, he desires to fulfill his own intentions. Everything from the way he looks to the way he behaves reveals him as a manipulator and a liar. He doesn't want to do his own dirty work, provoking other people to do it instead of him. And he doesn't care whether he puts other people's lives in danger or not. The Moon Tarot card, which relates to him, describes Vincent perfectly. It means something hiding behind a mask, something not to be trusted. Even his look is slightly different from the other characters in the game. The size of his pupils is different, and most of the time one eye is almost always looks at a player. During the game it's not so noticeable, especially in low resolution, but if you manage to take a good screenshot, you'll be able to see this. At first, the way this character looks was taken from an actor Ethan Hawke and his name from Vincent Gallo. And now only Heather is left. Her card is the Fool. But you shouldn't think that she's the main stupid girl here. The Fool means the new cycle of life. This relates to constant rebirth, like Alessa/Cheryl/Heather and her ability to give a new life to a new god. Also, this card may mean inconsideration, immaturity, reckless behavior, etc. Because Heather almost always behaves against the reason, relying exceptionally on her feelings. For example, what's the point of going to Silent Hill? Revenge won't bring Harry back, and Claudia definitely wants Heather to come to this town. She could just bury Harry and continue her living, destroying the plans of God's resurrection. But Heather doesn't do it and decides to avenge. She's actually quite unsocial and unfriendly, doesn't want to talk to anyone and may be even rude. At the same time, she's really trustful and constantly lets Vincent fool her and mislead.
Douglas really said that?
What's wrong? You don't trust me?
She got her appearance from an actress Charlotte Gainsbourg and Vanessa Paradis, and the person who gave the voice to the character was called Heather Morris, and as you may assume, she gave not only her voice, but the name as well. On early sketches, Heather had a long hair and she wore jeans, but after long discussions, it was decided to cut her hair so she would be not so cute. And in order to put out her femininity, it was decided to dress her into a small skirt instead of jeans. Pretty often through the game, Heather will stumble upon birthday congratulations in different forms. But every time the years would change. At first glance it doesn't make any sense, but let's look at it a little bit closer. So in Silent Hill 3, Heather is 17 years old. It's all clear here. But Heather is a reborn Cheryl, who was 7 in the first Silent Hill. So if we take 17 plus 7, we get 24 years old. But hold on for a second, we know that Cheryl is a half of Alessa's soul, who also was 7 years old at the moment of the ritual, so 17 plus 7 plus 7, all in all 31 years old. And finally, as long as Cheryl lived, Alessa lived with her. So we have to sum up her age as well. So here's what we get: Heather 17 years old, Cheryl 7 years old, 7 years old Alessa before the fire, and 7 years old after the fire. Altogether, our Shiro is 38 years old. That's what may happen if you ask a girl about her age.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear. Oh, I forgot your name.
Who are you?
Oh, okay, thanks. Happy birthday, dear. Who are you? Happy birthday to you. Happy 31st birthday.
And finally, the last interesting fact. During one of the dialogues with Vincent, he accuses her of being cruel and violent, that she likes to beat up and kill her enemies. Heather thinks that he's talking about monsters, and she gets a very interesting reply.
They look like monsters to you?
From this moment, we can make a conclusion that all monsters in the game may be just mere people, the minions of the cult, but Heather sees them as awful monsters. And judging by this conclusion, we may assume how Claudia managed to persuade one of the monsters/followers kill Harry Mason. Okay, now the monsters. Usually I talk about them quite a lot, but this time those monsters do not possess any sacral meaning. At least all descriptions from Lost Memories book explain the decryption of the names of monsters. Closer because hits in close combat, Doublehead because its head is split into two, Pendulum because it swings like one, Insane Cancer because it looks like a walking tumor, Scraper because it scrapes its knives, Nurse? Well, because she's a nurse. And some other ones. Bosses were not that original as well. Split Worm from the mall, Missionary who killed Heather's dad, and Leonard Wolf locked up in the hospital. There's nothing specific about them, but still there were a couple of monsters who had some special meaning. The first one is Memory of Alessa. The encounter happened on a carnival ride in the amusement park. Outwardly, this boss had a strong resemblance with Heather, except she was covered in blood and had black hair instead of blonde. This one was a dark part of Alessa's soul, which got separated after the ritual. Unable to struggle against an unbearable pain, she wanted to commit suicide and give up, although she continued her struggle when she saw Heather. Heather, by the way, didn't apprise her desire to die. She thinks that life deserves to be lived no matter what, and that decision is vividly seen in the end of the game. The last boss also looked like Alessa. In the end, Claudia gave birth to it, so it turned into a shape that Claudia imagined their god should look like. As we remember, she thought of Alessa as a saint, and all thoughts about her created this kind of monster. Masahiro Ito, the designer, once said that the image of the final boss was really hard to come up with. Creating this one was much harder and took much more time than any other enemy. And now we get closer to the main monster, although a player hasn't ever fought him in an open combat. This monster will be close to Heather through all her journey one way or another and turning red elves. But what makes him so special? Who is he and what's his role? His name is Valtiel, the god's attendant who has to protect his creator from danger. That's why he keeps following Heather, in order to protect her from enemies that harm her and not get born god. When Heather dies, he pulls her body somewhere and perhaps resurrects, being kind of the excuse for reloading of the game. By turning those valves, he controls the flow of supernatural world, making it more intensive or blocking it completely. Another interpretation of those valves is the cycle of God's resurrection. Also, we can map back Valtiel's connection even with the previous games. For example, we can find the same gloves and apron the Pyramid Head wore, and he also follows the main character through the game. Can it be so that under that pyramid there is a Valtiel's face hiding? Also, there were several sects in the cult of Silent Hill, and one of them was the sect of Valtiel. They wore white robes, which you were able to see in the first part, and they also wore red sack-like hoods, again having resemblance with pyramids. I think even developers don't know for sure whether these guesses are true or not. Of course, true fans would tell more about the meaning of every monster, but I think I'll leave these things for your personal research. But now let's take a look at this game apart from the plot and metaphors. The way of frightening players has changed. If the second Silent Hill was hasteless, relatively calm and melancholic, then the third part literally dives players in hell, performed a terror both visual and audio, adding to the game's sinister throat singing besides quite unpleasant ambient sounds. The game was a lot like the first part with all those rusty metal constructions instead of the floor and walls. It's all the same, but now in different parts of the game, a player could find some pulsing blood coming from the walls. Unseen before, this effect created horrifying dynamic textures that could literally shock players at first. The same thing referred to monsters. There were more of them, and the battles have become more action-oriented, which even had an impact on the music. Much faster and energetic compositions took place of calm and melancholic melodies. This time Akira Yamaoka decided to go further and added to his music some vocal. He intentionally went to America to perform rehearsals in order to find a specific voice pattern. Mary Elizabeth McGee was the one chosen from dozens of candidates, with whom Akira will continue working with in following parts of the franchise. Considering graphics, it hasn't changed much and was not so obvious as the difference between the first and the second part. Nevertheless, developers worked really hard on animation, their mimics and all in all everything that concerns characters. It looked so well that developers even refused to use pre-rendered cutscenes and performed them using the engine of the game. And even now those close-ups of the characters look really good. If we start speaking about some original moments of the frightening players, there was one moment. A player could find himself in a room with a huge mirror. No signs of trouble, but after some time the reflection in the mirror stopped moving. The room in the reflection started showing blood stains everywhere. They headed to the bath and disappeared in it, revealing in reality afterwards. The reflection didn't move, bloody stains were coming closer to Heather and she couldn't leave the room because the door was blocked. A player was simply astonished by such twists and effects. Or another example when Heather happened to visit a spooky house in the amusement park, and the place tries to scare a player with effects that are rather standard for such a place. But considering the town of Silent Hill, where the park is situated, those locations looked really original and fresh.
That's Danny.
And some more interesting aspects of the third part. For the first time the game took place not in Silent Hill right from the beginning, but in a completely different location. Only in the second part of the game, our protagonist comes to the Misty Town. There she had to visit places that a player could find in the second part, Brookhaven Hospital for example, and places from the first part. Also there were some unique levels as well, like the level in the church, which also has some unique features. The thing is that the map of this place was drawn by a child, not stylized to be like a child's drawing. The developers gave a little boy or a girl some pencils and paper, and an opportunity to draw the places however they wanted. And also we can call Robbie, a huge toy bunny appearing here and there, the symbol of the third part. A harmless toy but situated in the decorations of Silent Hill, covered in bloodstains and horrifying smile, sank into players' minds and probably visited their nightmares several times. All in all, the third part was not only the straight sequel of the first part, but also was quite similar in terms of the structure and plot. They all started in a supernatural world where the protagonist dies, after that waking up in a cafe and meeting the representative of the law, a police officer Sybil and a detective Douglas. Both of them stumble upon bad working TV sets, where the image of Cheryl appeared. Both of them had to fight bosses that looked like huge worms. Also they had a fight on the carnival ride. and the last level happened to be the plexus of corridors, floors and rooms from the protagonist's past. Whether it's a classroom, hospital room or Alessa's room. Both antagonists tried to resurrect a certain god, and both of them managed to do it, but died afterwards. And because of the substance called Aglaophotis, protagonists managed to kill the monster and leave Silent Hill. Such parallels are barely seen after the first walkthrough, but there is clearly a very strong connection to the first part. But still, there were some references to the second part as well. From quite obvious ones, like some posters hanging on the walls, to barely noticeable, that would reveal themselves only if there were saved games from Silent Hill 2 on the memory card. In this case, Heather would start making references to the second game. She talked about some letter from a dead wife and could notice a poster with Maria. But the most vivid reference was the scene with one of the toilet rooms. Heather wanted to put her arm in the toilet but changes her mind in a very last second, saying that only some crazy person would do such a thing. And James did exactly the same thing. Well, he was still not completely sane after all.
Who would even think of doing something so disgusting?
One more reference we can hear from Douglas. He said that he had been to Silent Hill before, looking for a missing man, who wasn't found after all. It's really possible that the missing man was James Sunderland. There were other references, like to works of Stephen King, the movie called Jacob's Ladder, Session 9 and others. Developers even used references to other Konami games, like a dead body immured into one of the walls. Heather says that this view reminds her of The Black Cat, the story of Edgar Allan Poe. Although developers claim that this is the reference to Metal Gear Solid, it's hard not to believe it since there is a military uniform and a gun silencer scene, the essential elements of MGS. You can even put the gun silencer on your gun and it will work perfectly. It's useful especially in fights with some monsters. There was a very funny Easter egg that concerned the Konami code. If you don't know about it, I'll leave a link in the description. If you use it in main menu, Douglas will be walking around through the game without pants. This looks a bit awkward actually. Some bonus weapons that a player could use after completing the game didn't stay on the sidelines. A player could find a flame gun, limitless ammo for assault rifle, and even a lightsaber. Well, we could expect that, but it took off from there. When Heather reached an unloading manifold in one of the rooms in the sewers, she could drop into the water a rusty metal pipe, which was one of the weapons. After that, a sewer fairy appeared and asked a few questions. And if the answers were correct, a player would not only get his metal pipe back, but also receive a silver and a gold ones. Unfortunately, the benefit of using those was minimal, so you could use it just for show-off. And the last weapon was not even some super blaster or something. If a player managed to kill more than 333 monsters, the nature of Heather herself changed, so she could fire lasers and energy out of her eyes. And if you add a special costume to this, well, people who are familiar with Sailor Moon at least a bit will get the gist. In this outfit, Heather's lasers were even more powerful, and using those two weapons in the game could open the ending with aliens. By the way, this outfit was not the only one in Silent Hill 3. For the first time in a whole franchise, a player could change how character looked. Some skins a player could get after completing some game challenges, some skins could be unlocked if a player used special codes, and some of them were given away by gaming magazines and sites. But most of them were usable only on PlayStation 2. The third part was released in May 2003 on PlayStation 2 and was ported in half of a year on PC. And so it was until 2012 when Konami released their Silent Hill HD collection on PlayStation 3. And I promised to tell you about this remake along with the second part. And you should know that both those remakes are disastrous. Okay, players had an opportunity to play in 16:9 aspect ratio, but that's all good I can say about this remake. First of all, the textures were highly cleaned up, so the game lost some atmosphere. It's clearly seen on the asphalt in the game. Secondly, because of some technical difficulties, the mist was not in 3D. Players even could observe some plain sprites of smoke there. In fact, there was less mist in general. That's why some cutscenes made players laugh and perform a facepalm gesture at the same time. Just look at this! Now you're clearly able to see the end of level, and the wire of rope ending on halfway. And there is more. Both games were too dark, and even with the highest settings of brightness, it was almost impossible to see anything. Visual bugs came out, sometimes the music and sounds simply could disappear. Poor Maria had a texture of teeth instead of her eye and vice versa, and this fine font was changed to Comic Sans. If you don't know the story of this font, you may look it up on the internet. And there were dozens of different failures, and the icing on the cake became voice work. The thing is that many actors who gave their voices to original game didn't give the permission to use their voices in the remake, so the developers had to hire new voice actors. And again, atmosphere was a victim. Even despite the fact that Troy Baker was responsible for James, it still didn't work out. That was more like the sound of mentally handicapped person than a loving and missing husband.
A dead person can't write a letter.
A dead person can't write a letter.
I'm not lying.
No, I believe you.
I'm not lying.
No, I believe you.
In the very last moment, all voice actors responsible for the original game agreed to take part in the remake, so in Silent Hill 2, a player could choose the variant he liked the most, unlike Silent Hill 3. That's why everyone had to deal with new voices. As a result, 17-year-old Heather sounded more like a 40-year-old woman.
A detective? Really? Well, nice talking to you.
A detective? Really? Well, nice talking to you.
Really?
Really?
Hereafter, Hygiene Studio, that was responsible for the remake, shared a very interesting information. Like the final code of the second and the third part was lost, so they had to remake damn near alpha versions of the game into HD and plug up dozens of bugs that were coming from everywhere. They released a rather big patch that fixed most of the problems. But even in this case, it's hard to call such a remake a success. Just like last time, Silent Hill received a very positive feedback from both critics and players. But was it really better? There is no concrete answer even now. Most of the fans split into two camps, the ones who think that the third part is the best, and the ones who liked the story of James Sunderland more. Even the designer Sada Takayoshi expressed his opinion once. He said that the third part was not as many-sided as the second part. This is just a simple horror and not some psychological thriller/horror. But everyone has an opinion, and everyone is able to choose what fits better for him. But still, both these games are by rights considered the classics of horror games and the best games in the franchise. Because the next game was quite a disputable and controversial creation, but we'll talk about it next time. Hope you liked it, so see you soon ladies and gents in a couple of weeks.